The horrifying reality of living under the Emperor's children is worse than any nightmare you can imagine. I know, because I lived it. My name is Jorvan Hale. Once, I was just a data worker in our city's administration. Now, I am the last witness. When their purple and gold ships appeared in our skies, we welcomed them with celebrations. We did not understand that their perfect faces hid monsters beneath. The screams of my neighbors became their favorite music. Human bodies were carved into living instruments that played melodies of pain. Those of us who survived learned to move like rats through the shadows of our broken city, always listening for the sound of their processions. The worst part was not the killing. It was how they made beauty from our suffering, turned our agony into art that could entrance even as it destroyed. I thought I could hide forever. I was wrong. What happens when the very gods of excess claim not just your flesh, but your reality itself? My name is Jorvan Hale, though names mean little now in Civitas Voluptas, the city of 1,000 pleasures. That is what they renamed our capital after the fall. Before their coming, I worked as a municipal data collator, tracking resource distribution for our governor. A small life, but mine. We had heard rumors of the Great Crusade, whispers of compliance and the Emperor's light. We prepared celebrations for when his warriors would arrive, not knowing which of his legions would claim us. When the ships appeared in orbit, they bore the purple and gold of the Emperor's children. The perfectionist sons of Fulgrim, known across the galaxy for their precision and glory. We lined the streets. We sang hymns of welcome. Some wept with joy. Our musical academies prepared their finest works, knowing this legion's appreciation for such things. The first drop pods crashed through our atmosphere on a clear morning. I remember how the sunlight caught on their armor as they emerged, iridescent and beautiful. Their weapons stayed holstered. Their voices were melodic when they spoke, each word precisely chosen. They requested our leaders come forward to discuss terms of peaceful compliance. I watched from my hab window as our governor and his council approached the Legion commander. The warrior removed his helmet, revealing a face of such impossible symmetry and grace that many gasped. I remember thinking that surely we were blessed to be welcomed by such perfect examples of humanity. I did not see the blade that took our governor's head. I only saw the fountain of crimson that followed and heard the strange, pleased sigh that escaped the legionnaire's lips as the blood splashed across his armor. What came next happened with such speed and deliberate grace that it seemed choreographed, as if they had practiced the movements 1,000 times. The white marble streets of our processional avenue became slick with blood. The screams rose like a chorus, and the warriors began to move differently, their bodies swaying as if keeping time with the sounds of terror. Some began to sing, their voices impossibly beautiful, harmonizing with the death cries of our people. I ran. Through service tunnels and maintenance shafts, I made my way home and gathered what supplies I could: food, water, my identification documents, though these would soon become worthless. From my high window, I could see the Legion moving through the city, their progress marked by rising smoke and strange colored lights that pulsed in patterns that hurt my eyes. That was 3 years ago. I live now in the shadows of what was once Administratum District 6. Most buildings stand empty, their inhabitants processed for whatever entertainments the Legion devised. Those of us who remain have learned to move like vermin, silent and unseen. We are not resistance. We are not rebels. We are simply those who have not yet been caught. I keep this record because I must believe someone will find it someday. That someone will know what happened here, that our suffering will be witnessed, even if it cannot be avenged. This is not a tale of heroism. There are no heroes in Civitas Voluptas. There is only survival, and what we surrender to achieve it. My first months in hiding were spent alone, moving from one abandoned hab to another, staying ahead of the patrols. I learned their rhythms, the strange rituals that dictated their movements through the city. They did not hunt us constantly. That would be too simple, too merciful. Instead, they staged great spectacles, processions they called revelations, where they would sweep through a district and capture any survivors they found. I witnessed one such revelation from the ventilation crawl space of what had been a Medicae facility. They moved in perfect formation, their armor no longer the proud purple and gold of the Emperor's children, but twisted into configurations that defied reason. Some had modified their armor to expose flesh beneath, skin covered in swirling tattoos that seemed to move of their own accord. Others had attached sound amplifiers that broadcast their every footfall, every breath, magnified to painful volumes. They drove before them a procession of the captured, citizens bound together with chains made not of metal, but what appeared to be sinew and nerve tissue that pulsed with unnatural life. The captives moved in a strange, unified gait, their steps perfectly synchronized despite their terror. Those who faltered were not killed. Instead, one of the warriors would approach, bearing a small silver case. From this, he would extract a vial of shimmering liquid and force the captive to drink. The effects were immediate and horrifying. The subject's body would contort, bones cracking as they realigned. Skin would stretch and split, revealing new growths beneath. But through it all, their consciousness remained. I could see it in their eyes, the awareness, the understanding of what was happening to them. Some screamed, others begged. A few laughed, a sound more terrifying than any cry of pain. I watched as one woman, perhaps my age, was transformed. Her fingers elongated until they resembled the strings of some grotesque instrument. Her ribcage opened like petals of a flower, revealing lung tissue that had reshaped itself into something resembling bellows. One of the Legion approached her, drawing a bow-like implement across her finger strings. The sound that emerged was beautiful, hauntingly so, a melody that brought tears to my eyes even as it turned my stomach. "Perfect," the Legionnaire whispered, his voice amplified by his helm's vox. "You shall play in the grand symphony. Your voice will join the cacophony of bliss." The procession continued, and I remained hidden, my hand pressed against my mouth to stifle any sound. Hours passed before they moved beyond my hiding place. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, to weep, to shake with the horror of what I had witnessed. That night, I found I could not sleep. The melody played by the woman's transformed body echoed in my mind. I found myself humming it, then caught myself and bit my tongue until I tasted blood. This was their power, I realized. Not just the physical corruption, but how they made beauty from horror, how they turned the profane into something that could touch the soul. In the days that followed, I began to notice changes in the city itself. Buildings were being reshaped, their structures altered to create new acoustic properties. Great amphitheaters rose in what had been residential districts. Towering speakers were mounted on spires, broadcasting sounds at all hours, sounds that defied description, oscillating between painful screeches and melodies so beautiful they could stop your heart. I learned to stuff my ears with fabric scavenged from abandoned habitations. It dampened the sounds but could not block them entirely. Some frequencies seemed to bypass the ears altogether, resonating directly in the bones of my skull, in the cavities of my chest. Food became scarce. The Legion had little interest in maintaining supply lines or food production. Their warriors did not seem to eat as humans do. The few functioning food distribution centers were traps, places where the desperate would gather, only to be harvested for whatever twisted purpose the Legion had conceived. I survived on stocks of emergency rations found in abandoned security outposts, on hydroponically grown fungi that flourished in the damp, dark places where I hid. Sometimes I would find others like me, survivors eking out an existence in the shadows. We would share resources when we could, information always, but we never stayed together long. Groups were easier to detect, and the Legion had ways of making captives reveal the locations of others. One man I met, an engineer named Drusus, had been working on mapping the Legion's movements, trying to understand their patterns. He believed there was logic to their madness, a method that, if understood, might be used to predict where they would go, when it might be safe to move. "They're creating something," he told me, his voice a hoarse whisper as we crouched in the ruins of a water reclamation plant. Not just capturing people, not just killing. All of this, the sounds, the architecture they're building, the transformations, it's all part of some greater work. I asked him what he meant, what purpose could possibly be served by such random cruelty. Not random, he insisted. Deliberate. Orchestrated. They're tuning the city itself, like an instrument, and we are the notes they wish to play. 3 days later, I found Drusus's body, or what remained of it. He had been opened from throat to groin, his internal organs removed and replaced with mechanical devices that continued to click and whir even in death. His mouth had been sewn open, fixed in a permanent scream, and from it emerged a soft, continuous tone, like a flute played by the wind. Around his neck hung a placard, inscribed with flowing script, "The disharmonious are retuned." I buried him as best I could, in the soft earth of what had once been a decorative garden. I took his notes, his maps, his observations of Legion movements. I did not understand all of his technical annotations, but I began to see the patterns he had identified. Certain districts were more active at specific times, certain buildings had been designated for specific purposes. The Legion had divided the city into sections they called movements, each with its own theme, its own particular brand of horror. In the first movement, the commercial district, they had established what they termed sensation markets, where captives were subjected to escalating experiments in pain and pleasure. The second movement, once our cultural center, now housed the galleries of transformation, where the most extensive physical modifications were performed. The third movement, the industrial sector, had become a vast workshop where Legion artificers crafted new instruments of torture disguised as art. And so it continued, each district repurposed for some aspect of their grand design. Drusus had identified 8 movements in total, with a 9th under construction in what had been our central administrative complex. I began to use this information to navigate the city more safely, to time my movements when Legion activity was focused elsewhere. It was during one such carefully planned excursion, seeking medical supplies from an abandoned clinic, that I encountered Maris. She had once been a medicae, specializing in trauma surgery. Now she operated a small underground network, treating those she could, providing palliative care for those beyond help. She had established her clinic in the sub-basement of a collapsed hab block, the rubble above providing both concealment and protection. "They don't just kill," she told me as she treated a fungal infection that had spread across my back. "That would be too simple, too final. They want subjects, experiments, audiences. They want witnesses to their artistry." Her hands were gentle, her touch clinical and impersonal, but it was the first human contact I had experienced in months that wasn't born of fear or necessity. I found myself telling her about Drusus, about his maps and theories. "He was right," she said, examining the papers I had brought. "They're building something. The city is becoming an instrument, and we are becoming the music. But to what end?" She introduced me to others who had found sanctuary with her. A former conductor from our Philharmonic, a sound engineer who had worked in our Vox broadcast facilities, a mathematician who had lectured at our principal university. Together, they had been studying the Legion's activities, trying to understand the patterns, the purpose behind the madness. The conductor, a thin man named Gallius whose fingers never stopped moving, as if constantly keeping time to some unheard melody, explained their findings. "It's a summoning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of this, the sounds they're creating, the harmonics they're establishing throughout the city, the people they're transforming, it's all designed to thin the veil between real space and the warp." I didn't understand. I was not versed in such matters. I knew of the warp as the means by which void ships traveled between stars, nothing more. The mathematician Lorelei tried to explain in terms I might grasp. "Imagine reality as a fabric," she said. "Normally, it's tightly woven, keeping us separate from what lies beyond. But certain patterns, certain frequencies and geometries can weaken that fabric, create resonances that allow things to pass through." "What things?" I asked. The sound engineer, a man called Thax who had replaced one of his eyes with an augmetic recording device, answered, "Entities, beings, the things that live in the spaces between spaces, the gods they worship." This was madness, I thought. Tales to frighten children. But I had seen enough impossible things since the Legion's arrival that I could not entirely dismiss their words. "What can be done?" I asked. "How can we stop it?" They exchanged glances, a silent communication born of long association. "We can't," Maris said finally. "The work is too far advanced, their control too complete, but we can document it, we can bear witness. We can ensure that whatever happens here, whatever they accomplish, someone will know." And so I joined their small collective, their fellowship of observers. We established a system of surveillance, using Drusus's maps to position watchers at key locations throughout the city. We recorded what we saw, what we heard, compiling a record of the Legion's activities, their rituals, their transformations of both the city's architecture and its remaining population. What we documented defies simple description. The Legion had begun organizing what they called performances, elaborate spectacles that combined elements of religious ceremony, theatrical presentation, and public torture. These were held in the newly constructed amphitheaters, with captive audiences arranged in concentric rings around a central stage. During one such performance, witnessed by Thax from a concealed observation point in the amphitheater's upper reaches, the Legion presented what they termed the Symphony of Ascension. 50 captives were brought to the stage, each already modified in some grotesque fashion. Some had been given extra limbs, others had their senses enhanced to impossible degrees, their eyes multiplied, their ears reshaped into elaborate spirals that covered the sides of their heads. The Legion conductor, a warrior whose armor had been reshaped to resemble an exploding ribcage, with bone-like protrusions extending outward in all directions, directed them to form a precise geometric pattern on the stage. Then, at his signal, they began to move, to vocalize, to play upon each other as if each was an instrument, and collectively they formed an orchestra. The sounds they produced began as discordant noise, painful to hear. But slowly, as the performance continued, the discord resolved into harmony, the separate parts finding a unified whole. The audience, comprised of both Legion warriors and captured civilians, responded with increasing agitation. Some began to sway in their seats, others to speak in tongues. Blood flowed from the eyes and ears of many. And then came the climax. The conductor raised his hands, now transformed into elongated, blade-like appendages, and brought them down in a single, decisive gesture. At that moment, every performer on stage underwent a simultaneous transformation. Their bodies seemed to liquefy, flowing together into a single mass of flesh and sensation. Screams turned to sighs, then to song. A melody that Thax reported caused him to experience visions of impossible landscapes and beings of incomprehensible geometry. At the center of this mass, a rift began to form, a tear in the very air. Through it poured a light that was not light, a radiance that darkened rather than illuminated. And from this rift emerged something. Thax's recording device failed at this point, the augmetic eye bursting in its socket. He fled, barely escaping with his life, his mind fractured by what he had glimpsed. When he returned to our sanctuary, he could not speak for days. When finally he found his voice, he would say only, "It comes." The Prince of Pleasure turns his gaze upon us. In the weeks that followed, the Legion's activities intensified. More districts were transformed, more citizens captured and reshaped. The sounds broadcast from the city's towers changed, becoming more complex, more insistent, worming their way into dreams and waking thoughts alike. Gallius was the first of our group to succumb. We found him one morning, his body contorted into an impossible shape, every joint dislocated and reset at unnatural angles. His mouth was stretched in what might have been agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell. Clutched in his hand was a page of sheet music, The notations unlike any conventional system, the marks resembling more wounds than notes. Lorelei studied it before we burned it, along with Gallius's remains. "It's a fragment," she said, "a piece of some larger composition." He was transcribing what he heard. We moved our sanctuary after that, abandoning the sub-basement for an old atmospheric processing facility on the city's edge. The air there was thick with chemical residue, burning the lungs and stinging the eyes, but the white noise of the still-functioning machinery helped to block the city's broadcast signals. Our number dwindled. Thax disappeared during a reconnaissance mission, leaving only his recording equipment behind. The footage showed nothing but static and brief, disjointed images of faces pressed against the inside of the lens, as if trying to emerge from the device itself. Lorelei lasted longer, her logical mind perhaps providing some defense against the influences pervading the city. But mathematics offered only so much protection. One night, she began drawing equations on the walls, complex formulae that spiraled outward from a central point. When Maris tried to stop her, Lorelei attacked, her face transformed by an expression of rapturous understanding. "The pattern is complete," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that should have been impossible for a human throat to produce. "The equation balances. All that remains is the final proof." She took her own life before we could restrain her, using a shard of broken glass to open her veins. As her blood flowed, it followed the lines of her equations, filling them as if the mathematical symbols were channels designed specifically for this purpose. Now only Maris and I remained, two witnesses in a city of horrors. We continued our documentation, our observation, though to what end I no longer knew. The Legion's work was reaching its culmination. The ninth movement, the central administrative complex, had been transformed into a vast, spiral structure that rose higher than any building had stood before. At its apex, a crystal spire caught and fractured the light, sending beams of impossible color across the city. "It's a beacon," Maris said as we observed from our new hiding place. "A lighthouse, calling across the warp." The Legion had announced a final performance, what they called the crescendo of communion. Heralds moved through the city, their voices amplified to reach even the deepest hiding places, proclaiming that all were invited, all would be welcome, all would participate in the grand finale of their work. We knew then that the end was near, that whatever they had planned would soon come to fruition. We made our preparations, gathering what documentation we had compiled, sealing it in containers designed to withstand extreme conditions. Maris believed that eventually someone would come, other forces of the Imperium perhaps, drawn by the silence of a world that had ceased all communication with its neighbors. "They must know what happened here," she insisted. "They must understand what the Legion has become, what they serve." The night before the crescendo, Maris came to me with a syringe filled with clear liquid. "A mercy," she explained. "If we're captured, if there's no other way out. It's quick, and as painless as anything can be in this place." I took it, tucking it into the inner pocket of my tattered administratum uniform. The fabric, once a point of pride, now hung in stained rags around my emaciated frame. Still, I kept it, some part of me clinging to the identity it represented. Jorvan Hale, administratum worker, citizen, human. That night, as we made final preparations, the Legion began their procession through the city. Even from our distant vantage, we could hear them coming, a march step that resonated through the ground, up through the soles of our feet, into our bones and teeth. With the procession came music, if such a word could describe the sounds that filled the air. It was beautiful and terrible, a composition that caught at something primal in the mind, that spoke to desires never acknowledged, to hungers never named. Maris clutched at her head, her face contorting. "Don't listen," she gasped. "Focus on something else, anything else." But there was nothing else. The music consumed all other sound, all other thought. It promised answers to questions I had never thought to ask, pleasures I had never dared to imagine. I found myself moving toward the door of our sanctuary, drawn by a compulsion I could neither understand nor resist. Maris grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into flesh with desperate strength. "Jorvan," she said, my name seeming to come from a great distance. "Jorvan, use the syringe. Now, before it's too late." I looked at her, this woman who had become my only companion in a world of madness, and I saw that she had already used her own dose. Her pupils were dilating, her breathing slowing. She smiled, a genuine expression that contained neither hysteria nor despair. "Witness," she whispered. And then she was gone, her body slumping to the floor. I should have followed her example. I should have used the mercy she had provided. Instead, I stepped over her body and walked out into the night, toward the music that called me with such sweet insistence. The streets were filled with people, survivors like myself who had hidden for months or years, now moving as one toward the central spire. Their faces showed the same compulsion that drove me, the same inability to resist the call. Some wept as they walked, others sang along with the music, their voices adding new harmonies to the composition. I walked among them, part of them, yet still separate enough to observe, to record in my mind what I was witnessing. This, I told myself, was my purpose. To see, to remember, to bear witness, as Maris had said with her dying breath. The procession led to the base of the spiral structure, where great doors stood open, pulsing with light that seemed to beat in time with the music. Legion warriors stood at attention, their armor now so modified that they barely resembled the proud space marines who had first descended upon our world. Their flesh merged with their plate, with instruments and amplifiers, with devices of unknown purpose. They did not stop us as we entered, did not speak or acknowledge our presence except to guide us toward the central chamber. The interior of the structure defied architectural logic, spaces expanding where they should have contracted, corridors looping back upon themselves in impossible configurations. Finally, we emerged into a vast amphitheater, larger than should have been possible within the confines of the building. Tier upon tier of seats surrounded a central stage, and these were already filled with thousands of spectators, some human, some so transformed that humanity was merely a distant memory. I found myself guided to a seat, my body complying while my mind screamed in silent protest. On either side of me sat others from the procession, their expressions ranging from terror to ecstatic anticipation. On the stage stood a single figure, a Legion commander whose armor had been reshaped into something resembling an orchestra conductor's formal attire. If such attire were made of living flesh and screaming faces, his helmet was gone, revealing a face of perfect, terrible beauty, its features symmetrical to a degree that hurt to look upon. He raised his hands, and the music, which had been building steadily, suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so profound that I could hear the beating of my own heart, the rush of blood in my veins. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space without need of amplification. "Welcome to the crescendo of communion, the final movement in our grand composition. For years, we have prepared this world, this city, tuning it to resonate with the harmonies of the warp. Today, we complete that work. Today, we open the way for our patron, the Prince of Pleasure, the Lord of Excess, the perfect reflection." Around the stage, Legion warriors took positions, each bearing an instrument fashioned from flesh and metal, from bone and sinew. At a gesture from the conductor, they began to play, a discordant noise that gradually resolved into complex, interwoven melodies. And as they played, the air above the stage began to shimmer, to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Colors swirled, impossible geometries taking shape and dissolving, reforming in new configurations. The conductor turned to face the audience, his expression one of transcendent joy. "Feel his approach," he cried. "Open yourselves to his touch, his blessing, his perfect corruption." A wave of sensation swept through the amphitheater, a tide of feeling so intense that many in the audience convulsed, their bodies unable to contain the extremity of experience. Pleasure and pain intermingled until they became indistinguishable from one another, each sensation amplified beyond human tolerance, beyond human comprehension. I felt it too, this overwhelming tide. It broke against my mind like a tsunami, threatening to sweep away all that I was, all that I had been. In that moment, I understood what the Legion had become, what they served, and the true nature of the horror they had brought to our world. They were not warriors anymore, not conquerors or even torturers. They were artists, composers working in the medium of human sensation, human transformation. And their canvas was reality itself, the fabric of existence that separated the material universe from the realm of their god. The rift above the stage widened, a tear in the world through which something was emerging. I could not look directly at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes perceived. But I could feel its presence, its attention turning toward the amphitheater, toward us, its assembled worshippers and sacrifices. In that moment of clarity, of understanding, I found the strength to move. My hand went to my pocket, to the syringe Maris had given me, the mercy, the escape. But as my fingers closed around it, another hand caught my wrist. I turned to see the person seated beside me, a woman whose features were vaguely familiar beneath the alterations that had been performed upon her. "Jorvan," she said, her voice distorted by the new configuration of her mouth, the multiple tongues that writhed behind her teeth. "I thought you had been processed long ago." It took me a moment to recognize her. Elara, a fellow administratum worker, someone I had passed in corridors and nodded to in data sanctums. Never a friend, barely an acquaintance, but now the only familiar face in a sea of strangers. "Elara," I whispered, "what have they done to you?" She smiled, an expression made grotesque by her modifications. "They have improved me," she said. "They have helped me hear the music as it is meant to be heard. And now I help them find others who need improvement." Her grip on my wrist tightened, her strength far greater than her slight frame suggested. With her free hand, she raised a small silver device and pressed it to her throat. "An unprocessed one," she said, her voice suddenly amplified, cutting through the music. "In Section 7, Row 12. The music did not stop, but I felt attention shift, focus narrowing upon me. The conductor turned, his perfect face registering first surprise, then pleasure. "Bring him," he commanded, and legionnaires moved through the audience, their massive forms navigating the crowded space with unnatural grace. I struggled against Elara's grip, finally breaking free only to find myself surrounded by warriors in twisted armor. They seized me, lifting me bodily from my seat, carrying me down toward the stage. The audience watched, their expressions ranging from sympathy to eagerness. Some reached out as I passed, their fingers brushing against me as if to take something, some essence or energy. On the stage, the conductor awaited, his hands still moving in time with the music, still directing the opening of the rift. As I was brought before him, he paused, turning his full attention to me. "A pure specimen," he said, his voice resonating within my skull rather than reaching my ears. "Untouched, unmarked, a blank canvas, preserved until this perfect moment." He reached out, one finger tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was like fire and ice, agony and ecstasy compressed into a single point of contact. I screamed, the sound lost in the crescendo of the music. "You shall have the honor," he continued, "of being the final note in our composition, the last brushstroke in our masterpiece. Through you, the veil will part completely. Through your transformation, the way will be opened." He gestured, and more legionnaires approached, bearing instruments of torture disguised as medical implements, as artistic tools. I saw scalpels and needles, saws and clamps, all crafted with an attention to aesthetic detail that made their purpose no less horrifying. "Prepare him," the conductor ordered, turning back to the rift, to the entity that was emerging by degrees, its presence a weight upon reality. They laid me on a table that had risen from the stage floor, securing my limbs with restraints that felt like living things, that tightened in response to my struggles. One of the legionnaires, his armor a grotesque parody of a medicae's robes, leaned over me, his faceplate retracted to reveal features that had once been human but were now stretched and reshaped into a permanent expression of ecstatic concentration. "Rejoice," he whispered as he selected a scalpel from his instruments. "Few are granted the privilege of such transformation. You will become art, you will become music, you will become a conduit for divinity." The blade descended, its edge catching the impossible light from the rift. I closed my eyes, not wanting the last thing I saw to be my own violation, my own unmaking. But even with eyes closed, I could still see. The blade's descent, the eager faces of the legion, the widening rift, and what waited beyond it, all were visible to some sense that transcended ordinary sight. The scalpel touched my skin, and with that first incision, something broke within me. Not my resolve, not my sanity, though both had been tested beyond their limits. No, what broke was some barrier between perception and understanding, between experience and knowledge. I saw the legion as they truly were, not as they appeared in physical form. I saw the corruption that had taken their perfect bodies, their disciplined minds, and twisted them into servants of excess and sensation. I saw the entity they worshipped, the being they sought to bring into our reality, not as some abstract concept or symbolic figure, but as a presence that defied categorization, that existed as pure experience, pure sensation. And in that moment of clarity, of terrible understanding, I found not despair but a strange, serene acceptance. This was the truth of our universe, the reality behind the veil of ordinary perception. There were gods in the warp, entities of unimaginable power and incomprehensible nature, and they hungered for the material realm, for the sensations and experiences only physical existence could provide. The Legion had become their instruments, their artists and composers, working to reshape reality itself into a form more pleasing to their patron. And I, Jorvan Hale, unremarkable administratum worker, was to be the final component in their grand design, the key that would unlock the door between worlds. The scalpel continued its work, tracing patterns on my flesh that corresponded to the music still playing around us. Each cut, each modification, was performed with exquisite precision, with an artist's attention to detail. They were not merely torturing me, they were transforming me, reshaping me, according to some pattern I could not comprehend, but could feel taking form with each incision, each alteration. The pain was beyond description, beyond the capacity of human nervous systems to process. Yet I remained conscious, remained aware, my mind expanding to accommodate sensations that should have driven me mad, should have mercifully shut down my awareness. I heard my own voice joining the music, screams becoming notes in the composition. I felt my body changing, not just from the Legion's ministrations, but from within, cells and tissues responding to the proximity of the warp, to the influence of the entity emerging through the rift. The conductor moved around me as I was transformed, his hands guiding the legionnaires in their work, his voice offering commentary and direction. "The resonance is perfect," he said at one point. "The flesh responds as it should, the patterns align with the harmonics we have established." Time lost meaning. I existed in a state of pure sensation, pure transformation. I was no longer Jorvan Hale, no longer human in any meaningful sense. I was becoming an instrument, a conduit, a living gateway between realities. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The music, the pain, the transformation. A silence fell, so complete that it seemed like a physical presence, a weight pressing down upon the amphitheater. The conductor stood frozen, his face registering shock, then fear. He turned toward the rift, which had begun to contract rather than expand, its edges pulling inward, the colors and geometries destabilizing. "No," he whispered, his perfect voice cracking. "No, this is not possible. The calculations were exact, the resonances perfect." From beyond the rift came a sound, a note of such profound wrongness that it caused physical pain to all who heard it. The audience clutched at their ears, their throats, their chests, as if the sound were a solid thing forcing its way into their bodies. The conductor fell to his knees, blood streaming from his eyes, his nose, his ears. "My lord," he gasped, "we have failed you. Forgive us. Guide us to correct our error." But there was no forgiveness from beyond the rift, only that terrible sound, that note of negation and rejection. The entity that had been emerging began to withdraw, its presence diminishing, the weight of its attention lifting from the amphitheater. With its withdrawal came a backlash of energies, a rebound effect as the thinned barrier between real space and the warp suddenly reasserted itself. The rift contracted violently, collapsing inward with a sound like the death cry of a star. The shock wave rippled outward, striking first the conductor, then the legionnaires around him, then spreading to the audience. Wherever it touched, it brought transformation of a different kind, a reversal or perversion of the changes the Legion had worked so hard to create. The conductor's perfect face melted like wax, features running together, reforming in random, hideous configurations. His armor, which had been a masterpiece of corruption and enhancement, began to twist and buckle, crushing the body within. Around me, the legionnaires suffered similar fates. Some collapsed into themselves, their modified bodies imploding as if consumed from within. Others expanded, bloating and rupturing in sprays of fluid that steamed where it touched the stage. The audience was not spared. Their screams now were purely of terror and agony, without the undertone of ecstasy that had characterized their earlier vocalizations. I lay on the table, still bound, still transformed, watching as the amphitheater descended into chaos. The restraints that held me loosened as whatever consciousness had animated them died. I pulled free, my body responding strangely to my commands. I looked down at myself, trying to comprehend what I had become. My flesh had been reshaped, incisions forming patterns across my torso and limbs. Some wounds had been sealed with metal filaments that pulsed with fading energy. Others remained open, yet did not bleed, the edges fused and cauterized. I could feel new structures within my body, additions and modifications whose purpose I could not fathom. But I was still myself, still Jorvan Hale, still conscious, still possessed of my own will. The transformation had been interrupted before it could be completed, before I could be fully converted into whatever conduit or instrument the Legion had intended. I stood on legs that felt too long, too jointed, and made my way across the stage. The conductor lay nearby, his body still twitching as the armor continued its collapse, grinding bone and organ into paste. His eyes found mine, recognition flaring briefly. "The god rejected us," he gurgled through a mouth that now occupied most of the left side of his face. "Our work was found wanting. Imperfect." He reached out with a hand that was more talon than human appendage. "Kill me," he pleaded. "Grant me the final sensation." I looked at him, this being who had brought such horror to my world, who had transformed existence itself into an experiment in sensation and corruption. I felt no pity, no mercy, only a cold, clear certainty. "No," I said, my voice strange in my altered throat. "Live with your imperfection." I left him there, making my way through the chaos of the amphitheater. The structure itself was beginning to collapse, its impossible geometries becoming unstable as the warp energies that had sustained them dissipated. Chunks of ceiling fell, crushing those below. Walls bulged and buckled, floors rippled and split. The audience was fleeing, those who still could. Some had been too altered by the Legion's earlier work to move normally, crawling or slithering toward exits that seemed to shift and relocate as the building's internal logic failed. Others were simply trampled in, the panic, bodies crushed underfoot. I moved against the tide, my altered form providing strength and resilience I had not possessed before. I had no clear destination in mind, only a driving need to escape, to survive, to bear witness to whatever came after. I found an exit, a doorway that led not to corridors but directly outside, to the base of the spiral structure. The city beyond was in turmoil. The amplifiers and broadcast towers were emitting bursts of discordant noise, random fragments of the music that had filled the air earlier. Buildings reshaped by the Legion were collapsing or transforming again, their new configurations even less aligned with natural law. In the sky above, the crystal spire at the apex of the spiral structure was fracturing, shards raining down on the city below. Each fragment caught and refracted light, sending beams of impossible color cutting through the air like solid things, slicing through whatever they touched. I moved through streets littered with debris and bodies, past scenes of desperate flight and horrible transformation. Some citizens, those who had been only partially modified by the Legion, were reverting to more human forms, though rarely completely, and never without cost. Others, those whose alterations had been more extensive, were suffering grotesque further changes, their bodies rebelling against the conflicting influences of warp energy and material reality. Legionnaires were scattered throughout the city, some continuing their work even as the grand design collapsed around them, others turning on each other in rage or despair. I witnessed a warrior whose armor had fused with his flesh, turning him into a grotesque amalgamation of ceramite and meat, tearing apart a fellow legionnaire with hands that were more industrial tools than human appendages. "Imperfect," he screamed as he worked. "All imperfect. We must remake, rebuild, begin again." I avoided them when I could, hid when I could not. My altered form made me less immediately recognizable as unprocessed, as a potential subject for their attentions. To their eyes, I might have appeared as just another of their works, another transformed citizen stumbling through the chaos. I made my way toward the edge of the city, toward the atmospheric processing facility where Maris and I had established our last sanctuary. I do not know why I returned there. Perhaps some instinct drove me to the last place I had known safety, however relative, however temporary. Perhaps I simply needed to confirm what I already knew, that Maris was gone, that I was now truly alone. The facility stood as we had left it, untouched by the collapse occurring within the city proper. The chemical haze surrounding it had perhaps protected it, making it unattractive to the Legion's aesthetic sensibilities, too industrial, too functional to be incorporated into their grand design. I entered, moving through familiar corridors to the chamber where I had left Maris. Her body remained, undisturbed, her face still composed in that final, serene smile. I sat beside her, my altered form folding into configurations that should have been impossible, should have been painful, but which now felt natural. I witnessed, I told her, though she could not hear. I saw it all, the performance, the rift, the entity, and I saw it reject them, reject their work. I saw it all collapse. I remained there for hours, or perhaps days. Time had become difficult to track, my perception altered along with my body. Eventually, hunger drove me to move, to search for sustenance. The supplies we had gathered were still there, untouched. I ate, finding that my altered digestive system could still process ordinary food, though it derived little satisfaction from it. In the days that followed, I ventured out occasionally, watching the city from a distance. The collapse continued, a slow unraveling rather than a sudden catastrophe. The Legion presence diminished gradually. Some warriors departed in dropships that rose to meet vessels in orbit. Others simply disappeared, perhaps seeking new venues for their artistry, new stages for their performances. Those citizens who survived began to emerge from hiding, to reclaim what could be reclaimed of their city, their lives. Many bore the marks of the Legion's attention, modifications both subtle and extreme. They moved differently now, these survivors, keeping to shadows, avoiding open spaces, gathering in small groups that would disperse at the first sign of danger. I observed them but did not join them. My transformation, though incomplete, had left me too altered, too obviously touched by the Legion's work. I feared their reaction, their rejection, or worse, their worship. For some had begun to form cults around the experience, around the memory of the sensations the Legion had introduced. They gathered in the ruins of the amphitheaters, recreating fragments of the performances, seeking to recapture some echo of that terrible ecstasy. Instead, I remained in my sanctuary, venturing out only when necessary for supplies or observation. I compiled what I had witnessed, what I had experienced, recording it as best I could with hands not designed for holding writing implements. I used materials salvaged from the facility, technical manuals, and data slates repurposed as journals, as testimony. Months passed. The city stabilized, though it would never return to what it had been before the Legion's arrival. Too much had been altered, too many had been changed. New structures grew in the ruins of the old, strange hybrid architectures that combined the practical necessities of survival with echoes of the Legion's aesthetic. The populace adapted, as humans always do. They developed new customs, new social structures to accommodate their altered reality. Those most severely transformed formed their own communities, finding ways to function despite their modifications. Others, those less visibly changed, attempted to recreate the routines and institutions of the before time, establishing markets, governing councils, defensive militias. I watched it all from a distance, a silent observer, the last witness to the full arc of our world's violation and partial recovery. I knew that someday others would come, imperial forces drawn by the silence of a once compliant world, or perhaps by distress signals sent by those citizens with the technical knowledge to reach beyond our atmosphere. When they arrived, they would find a population forever marked by the Legion's presence, a city whose very stones bore the imprint of their corruption. They would see the cults, the mutations, the lingering influence of warp energies. They would make their judgments, enforce their imperial creed of purity and conformity. I did not expect mercy from these future arrivals. The Imperium's response to corruption, to taint, is well documented. Fire cleanses all sin. But until that day of judgment, I would continue my observation, my documentation. I would bear witness not just to what had been done to us, but to how we survived it, how we rebuilt from the ruins of perfection. 1 year to the day after the failed crescendo, I ventured closer to the city center than I had dared previously. I was drawn by reports, whispered among the survivors I sometimes traded with, of activity at the ruined spiral structure, activity that echoed the Legion's patterns. I approached cautiously, using the network of ruins and abandoned tunnels that I had mapped during my months of observation. The structure still stood, though much diminished, its spiral form partially collapsed, the crystal spire long since shattered. But light glowed within, pulsing in complex patterns that stirred uncomfortable memories. I found a vantage point in the hollow shell of what had once been a commercial tower, using my altered vision to peer across the intervening distance. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. A group had gathered in the ruins of the amphitheater. Some were former citizens, bearing the marks of the Legion's modifications. Others were new arrivals, void crew perhaps from passing vessels, lured by rumors of transcendent experience. And moving among them, directing their efforts, were figures in purple and gold armor, not Legion warriors, but humans dressed in crude approximations of their livery. They were recreating the ritual, these devotees, rebuilding the stage, positioning amplifiers and resonators, marking out the geometric patterns that had been used in the original performance. Their resources were limited, their understanding incomplete. They worked from fragmentary memories, from corrupted recordings, from the half-understood ravings of those who had witnessed the crescendo and survived with minds at least partially intact. But their devotion was absolute, their dedication to the principle of perfect sensation, perfect experience, undiminished by the failure of the original ritual. They believed, these cultists, that the Legion had simply made some small error in execution, some minor flaw in the composition that could be identified and corrected. I watched them work, day after day, gradually reassembling the components of catastrophe. They lacked the Legion's resources, their warp-touched artistry, their transhuman capabilities. But they compensated with numbers, with fanaticism, with a willingness to sacrifice whatever and whoever was necessary to achieve their goal. I knew I should leave, should retreat to my sanctuary and wait for the inevitable failure of their efforts. No human could recreate what the Legion had attempted, could channel the energies they had manipulated. These cultists were doomed to disappointment at best, to horrible death at worst. But I remained, compelled by the same need to witness that had driven me since the beginning. I had seen the full cycle of the Legion's work, from arrival to catastrophic failure. I needed to see this epilogue, this human coda to their inhuman composition. The cultists completed their preparations and began their performance, a pale imitation of the original crescendo. Their music was discordant, lacking the warp-touched harmonies that had made the Legion's composition so compelling, so transformative. Their rituals were clumsy approximations, based on misunderstood observations and corrupted memories. I watched, waiting for the inevitable moment when their failure would become apparent, when their borrowed aesthetic would collapse under the weight of reality's resistance. And yet, as their performance continued, I began to sense something shifting, some change in the quality of light, in the propagation of sound. They were achieving something, these devoted amateurs. Not the full manifestation the Legion had attempted, not the complete thinning of the veil between realities, but a partial success, a minor weakening, a small rent in the fabric of existence. Above their makeshift stage, the air began to shimmer, to ripple in patterns reminiscent of the original rift. Colors swirled, geometries formed and dissolved, and through this disturbance, something looked back. Something noticed their efforts, their devotion. I felt its attention, its regard sweeping over the assembled cultists, over the ruined city beyond, and, briefly, over my observation post. I experienced again that terrible moment of clarity, of understanding beyond what human minds were meant to comprehend. The entity was aware of this world, this city. The Legion's work had marked it, had made it visible across the boundaries between realities, and though the original ritual had failed, had been rejected as imperfect, the impression remained, the connection, however tenuous, still existed. The cultists felt it too, this attention. They responded with increasing fervor, their movements becoming more frantic, their vocalizations more extreme. Some began to transform, their bodies responding to the proximity of warp energy, to the regard of the entity they sought to summon. But these transformations were not the calculated aesthetic modifications the Legion had performed. They were chaotic, uncontrolled, painful. Flesh flowed like liquid, reformed in random configurations. Bones snapped and reshaped. Internal organs shifted, failed, were replaced by structures that served unknown purposes. I watched in horror as the ritual degenerated into slaughter, as cultist turned upon cultist, driven by impulses they could not control, by hungers they could not name. The violence spread outward from the central stage, consuming the entire gathering in a frenzy of sensation and destruction. And through it all, the rift remained, small but persistent, a window through which the entity continued to observe, to influence, to corrupt. It would not manifest, would not physically enter our reality as the Legion had intended, but its presence would be felt. Its influence would spread, carried by the survivors of this failed ritual, by the energies unleashed during their attempt. I retreated then, fled back to my sanctuary, to the safety of the chemical haze and machinery noise. But I knew, with terrible certainty, that what I had witnessed was not an end but a beginning. The Legion had departed, their grand design in ruins. But they had left behind converts, believers, humans, who had tasted the extremes of sensation and would spend their lives seeking to recapture that experience. They would try again, perhaps not here, perhaps not soon, but somewhere, somewhen, the attempt would be made. The composition would be refined, the errors corrected, and eventually, perhaps, the veil would part completely, the entity would manifest in its full glory and horror. I continue my observation, my documentation. I record what I have seen, what I understand, in the hope that someone will find this testimony, will recognize the warning it contains. The Legion is gone from our world, but their legacy remains. Their corruption persists in the minds and bodies of those they touched, those they transformed. I am Jorvan Hale, the last witness, the final observer. My body bears the marks of their artistry, my mind the imprint of their god's attention. I exist now to record, to remember, to warn. The Emperor's children brought perfect horror to our world, a corruption so complete, so absolute, that it transformed the very nature of existence. They made a masterpiece of our suffering, an orchestra of our screams. And though their composition failed in its ultimate goal, its echoes will resonate through the warp for eternity, a siren call to those who seek the extremes of experience, who worship at the altar of sensation. Beware the servants of the Prince of Pleasure. Beware their beauty, their artistry, their promise of perfect experience, for in their perfection lies the seed of all corruption, all destruction. In their harmony, the death of all things. I am Jorvan Hale. I witness the symphony of flesh, and I will bear that witness until my final breath, until the last note of my existence fades into silence. In the months since I observed the cultists' failed ritual, I have noticed changes in my transformed body. The modifications performed by the Legion's artificers, incomplete as they were, continue to evolve, to adapt. My flesh reshapes itself in small, subtle ways, responding to stimuli I cannot consciously perceive. My senses have sharpened beyond human norm, allowing me to detect variations in light and sound that should be imperceptible. My dreams are filled with music I have never heard, with colors I cannot name when waking. I fear what these changes might portend, what I might become if the process continues unchecked. Yet I find myself strangely accepting, even curious. The Legion sought to make me a conduit, an instrument through which their god might manifest. Instead, I have become something neither fully human nor truly corrupted, a witness whose very existence straddles the boundaries between states of being. Perhaps this is why I survived when so many others did not. Perhaps this liminal state, this threshold existence, allows me to observe and comprehend what would drive others to madness or worship. I stand at the edge of understanding, able to look in both directions, to see both human suffering and inhuman purpose with equal clarity. The city continues its slow evolution, its adaptation to the aftermath of the Legion's presence. New cults have emerged, each with its own interpretation of what occurred, its own approach to the legacy of corruption. Some seek to cleanse, to purify, adopting rituals of self-mortification and ascetic denial as a counter to the excesses the Legion promoted. Others embrace the transformation, celebrating their mutations as gifts, as evolutions toward some higher state of being. Most exist somewhere between these extremes, simply trying to survive in a world forever altered, forever tainted by exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. They rebuild their homes, their communities, their lives, working around the architectural remnants of the Legion's grand design, adapting to the lingering effects of warp exposure on their environment, their bodies, their minds. I have begun to interact more directly with these survivors, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence as I discovered that my altered form, far from marking me as an outcast, grants me a certain status among them. They see me as someone who was chosen, who was worked upon by the Legion's own hands, who survived the central ritual of the crescendo. Some approach me as a prophet, seeking wisdom or guidance, others as a relic, a living connection to an event that has already passed into myth among the populace. A few recognize me for what I truly am, a witness, an observer, a recorder of what occurred and what continues to unfold. It is to these last that I speak most freely, sharing what I have seen, what I understand, what I fear. They in turn share their own observations, their own experiences, helping me to compile a more complete record of the Legion's impact, of the ongoing consequences of their presence. One such individual, a woman named Varian who had once been a historian at our principal university, has become a particular confidant. She survived the Legion's occupation by hiding in the university's subterranean archives, surrounded by texts and records that held no interest for beings concerned solely with sensation and experience. They never understood true knowledge. She told me during one of our conversations, information without application, understanding without utility. They sought only what could be felt, what could be experienced directly. The abstract, the theoretical, these held no appeal. Her observations helped me to contextualize what I had witnessed, to place the Legion's actions within a framework that made them comprehensible, if no less horrific. They were artists of the most extreme sort. She explained. Art divorced entirely from representation or meaning, concerned only with effect, with impact. They sought to create experiences so intense, so overwhelming, that they would crack the very foundations of reality, allow their God to manifest directly in the material realm. And they failed, I reminded her. This time, she agreed, in this place. But they will try again. It is their nature, their purpose. And each attempt brings them closer to success, teaches them more about the boundaries between realities, about the conditions necessary for manifestation. Her words troubled me, reinforcing my own fears about the future, about what might await not just our world but all worlds touched by the Legion's corrupting presence. But they also strengthened my resolve to continue my observation, my documentation. If the threat persisted, if the attempt would be made again, then the warning must be preserved, must be spread beyond our isolated world. Varian and I began to work together, combining her historical knowledge with my first-hand observations. We gathered accounts from other survivors, comparing perspectives, identifying patterns, constructing a comprehensive record of the Legion's occupation and its aftermath. We established a small archive in the atmospheric processing facility, using its isolated location and chemical protection as security against those who might wish to suppress our work, to maintain the growing mythology around the Legion's presence rather than the more complex, more terrible truth. Other collaborators joined us over time, bringing their own expertise, their own perspectives. A former tech priest, his augmetics partially transformed by warp exposure, helped us understand the technological aspects of the Legion's work, the machines and devices they had constructed to amplify and direct warp energies. A Medicae, who had been forced to assist in the Legion's transformative surgeries, provided insights into the physical modifications, the biological engineering that had turned citizens into instruments, into components of the grand design. Together, we pieced together a more complete understanding of what had occurred, what was still occurring in the aftermath. The Legion had not simply sought to summon their God, to bring it physically into our reality. They had sought to transform reality itself, to remake our world into a place where the boundaries between dimensions were permanently weakened, where sensation and experience could reach intensities impossible under normal physical laws. Their failure had been one of execution, not conception. The patterns they had established, the resonances they had created, were fundamentally sound. But something in the final implementation, some detail of timing or geometry or harmony, had been flawed, had caused their God to reject the offering, to withdraw its manifestation. This understanding brought both hope and despair. Hope, because it suggested that such manifestations were difficult, required precise conditions that might be hard to replicate. Despair, because it confirmed that the attempt was possible, that success required only refinement, only correction of whatever error had been made. As our work continued, as our archive grew, we began to notice changes in the city, in the population. The cults were consolidating, smaller groups being absorbed by larger ones, doctrinal differences being resolved or suppressed. A new leadership was emerging, individuals who claimed direct communication with the entity the Legion had worshipped, who professed to understand the errors made during the crescendo, to know how they might be corrected. They called themselves the Choir of Perfection, and they were gathering followers, resources, influence. Their leaders wore robes of purple and gold, their faces concealed behind masks of extraordinary beauty, each depicting a human visage in the moment of ecstatic revelation. They moved through the city with growing confidence, recruiting actively, promising transcendent experience to those who joined their ranks. We observed them from a distance, using the network of informants and observers we had established. Their rituals were subtle at first, focused on music and movement, on the creation of experiences intense, but not extreme. But gradually, they began to incorporate elements of the Legion's practices, modified and adapted for human participants, human subjects. They're building towards something, Varian observed as we reviewed reports from our informants. Establishing the foundations, the basic patterns, but slowly, gradually, allowing participants to adapt, to become conditioned to the sensations and the experiences. I recognized the truth in her assessment. The Legion had moved too quickly, had imposed their design upon a population unprepared for such extremes of sensation, such violations of natural law. The choir was taking a more measured approach, cultivating willing participants, developing the conditions for their ritual over months and years rather than days and weeks. "We need to warn someone," I said. "Someone beyond our world, someone with the power to intervene." Varian looked skeptical. "The Imperium? They would purge the entire population without distinction, seeing only corruption, only taint, and they would be partially right to do so. We are all marked by what occurred here, all changed in ways visible and invisible." "Then who? Who can we turn to?" She had no answer, and neither did I. We continued our observation, our documentation, even as the choir grew in power and influence, even as their rituals became more elaborate, more extreme, more closely aligned with the patterns the Legion had established. We began to notice other changes as well, more subtle but perhaps more significant. The warp storms that had surrounded our world since the failed crescendo were diminishing, the barriers between our reality and the immaterium strengthening rather than weakening. Communication with other systems, impossible in the immediate aftermath of the ritual, was becoming theoretically possible again, though we lacked the means to take advantage of this change. "They're waiting," Varian suggested when I pointed out these observations. "The entity, the prince they worship, it's withdrawing its direct influence, allowing the veil between realities to heal, to strengthen, not out of mercy or disinterest, but because a proper summoning, a proper manifestation, requires the breaking of barriers, not their exploitation. It needs to be invited in, not to force its way through." The implication was clear. The choir's work, its gradual building of patterns and resonances, was preparation for another attempt at manifestation, another crescendo. But this time, the conditions would be more controlled, the participants more thoroughly prepared, the execution more precise. We redoubled our efforts to document, to understand, to prepare our warning for whoever might eventually come to our world. We established multiple archives, hiding copies of our work throughout the city and its surroundings, increasing the chances that some record would survive whatever came next. And as we worked, I continued to change, to evolve. The modifications the Legion had begun continued their slow progression, my body adapting to some design I could not fully comprehend, but could feel working its way toward completion. I began to hear music in silence, to see patterns in empty space, to sense presences beyond the material realm. Varian noticed these changes, watched me with a combination of scientific curiosity and human concern. "You're becoming something new," she observed. "Neither what they intended nor what you were before, but something between states, between categories." I could not deny it. I existed now in a liminal space, my perceptions extending beyond normal human boundaries, my understanding encompassing concepts that should have been incomprehensible. I was becoming a more perfect witness, a more complete observer, able to see and record aspects of reality invisible to others. This transformation brought new insights, new perspectives on what the Legion had attempted, what the choir was now preparing. I could see the patterns more clearly, could understand the mathematics and harmonics that underlay their rituals, their modifications, their architecture. I could perceive the resonances they established, the ways in which these echoed through both material reality and the immaterium. And I could sense the entity watching, waiting, its attention focused on our world with patient hunger, with perfect anticipation of what was to come. The choir's preparations accelerated, their rituals becoming more elaborate, more public. They began construction on a new amphitheater, smaller than the Legion's grand structure but more precisely designed, its acoustics and geometries, refined based on what they had learned from the failed Crescendo. Citizens were recruited, volunteers now rather than captives, willing participants in the transformations, the modifications, the rehearsals for the final performance. They submitted to surgeries, to chemical treatments, to warp-touched enhancements, their bodies gradually reshaped into the instruments the ritual would require. We watched, we documented, we prepared our warning. But increasingly, I found myself drawn to more direct observation, to closer proximity to the choir's work. My altered perceptions allowed me to understand aspects of their design that remained invisible to my colleagues, to grasp the full scope and purpose of what they were creating. One night, against Varian's advice, I ventured into the heart of the choir's territory, to the partially completed amphitheater where their most advanced rituals were performed. I concealed myself in a service conduit, using my altered senses to penetrate the barriers between myself and the central chamber to witness what occurred there. What I saw confirmed our worst fears. The choir had recreated the essential elements of the Legion's design, had corrected the errors that had led to its rejection. Their understanding was incomplete, their implementation limited by human capabilities and resources, but the fundamental pattern was sound, the basic resonances established. In the center of the amphitheater stood a figure I recognized, though I had not seen him in over a year. The conductor, the Legion commander who had directed the original Crescendo, he had survived the collapse, the rejection, the withdrawal of his god's favor. His perfect face was gone, replaced by a grotesque assemblage of features that shifted and flowed even as I watched. His armor was a ruin, more organic than ceramic now, fused with his flesh in configurations that should not have allowed movement, let alone the precise gestures he now performed. But it was him, unmistakably. And he was directing the choir's efforts, guiding their rituals, correcting their errors, refining their techniques. He had remained hidden until now, allowing human proxies to establish the foundations of the work, to gather the resources and participants needed. Only when the preparations were sufficiently advanced had he emerged, taking direct control of the final stages. I watched as he directed a rehearsal, a partial performance of what would become the new Crescendo. The music was beautiful, terrible, its harmonies extending into ranges I could now perceive but could not describe in human language. The participants moved with inhuman grace, their modified bodies responding to the conductor's gestures with perfect precision, perfect synchronization. Above the central stage, the air began to shimmer, to ripple in patterns I recognized from the original ritual. But this disturbance was controlled, contained, a deliberate thinning rather than a rupture. Through it, I sensed again the attention of the entity, its regard now focused, intent, evaluating the preparations with critical appreciation. I remained until the rehearsal concluded, until the participants dispersed and the conductor withdrew to whatever sanctuary he had established. Then I returned to our archive, to Varian and our colleagues, to report what I had witnessed. They listened in silence, their expressions growing more grave as I detailed the conductor's survival, his direction of the choir's efforts, the advanced state of their preparations. "How long?" Varian asked when I had finished. "How long until they attempt the full ritual, the new Crescendo?" I considered what I had seen, what I had sensed of their progress, their readiness. "Weeks," I said finally. "Perhaps a month, no longer. They are nearly prepared, nearly ready. The patterns are established, the participants conditioned, the instruments tuned. All that remains is the final refinement, the perfect alignment of all elements. And then they will attempt again what the Legion attempted before, to open a permanent gateway between realities, to allow their god to manifest fully in the material realm. And this time, I believe they may succeed." The implications hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. Success would mean the end of our world as we knew it, its transformation into something beyond human comprehension, beyond human survival. Even partial success, even a limited manifestation, would result in corruption and suffering on a scale we could hardly imagine. "We have to stop them," one of our colleagues said, breaking the silence. "We have to find a way to disrupt the ritual, to prevent the manifestation." The suggestion was met with mixed reactions, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads at the impossibility of the task. The choir numbered in the thousands now, their resources and influence substantial, their territory well defended. And at their center, directing their efforts, stood a transhuman warrior, a legion commander with centuries of experience in both warfare and warpcraft. "What can we do against such power?" someone asked. "What hope do we have of succeeding where even the Imperium failed?" I considered the question, considering what I had seen, what I had come to understand through my altered perceptions. The Legion's failure had not been due to Imperial resistance, to human intervention. It had been due to imperfection in their design, in their execution. The entity they worshipped demanded nothing less than perfection in all things, rejected anything that fell short of that impossible standard. "We don't need to defeat them," I said slowly, the plan forming as I spoke. "We need only to ensure they fail again, that their ritual falls short of perfection. Even a small error, a minor disruption at a critical moment, could cause their god to reject the offering, to withdraw its manifestation." "How?" Varian asked. "How can we introduce such an error without being detected, without being stopped before we can act?" I touched my chest, feeling the modifications beneath my skin, the transformations that continued their slow progression. "Through me," I said. "I was part of their original design, intended as a key component in the first crescendo. My transformation was interrupted, incomplete, but it continues even now, progressing towards some predetermined end." Understanding dawned in Varian's eyes. "You would infiltrate them," she said. "Present yourself as a willing participant, a valuable addition to their ritual due to your existing modifications." "Yes. I would allow them to complete what the Legion began, to incorporate me into their design as I was meant to be incorporated into the original. But when the critical moment comes, when the gateway begins to open, I would introduce a discordant element, a flaw in the pattern." The room fell silent as they considered my proposal, its dangers, its slim chance of success, the sacrifice it would require. "You would not survive," Varian said finally. "Even if you succeeded in disrupting the ritual, the backlash would destroy you, as it nearly destroyed the conductor and his warriors in the original failure." "I know," I acknowledged. "But what is my life against our world, against the countless lives that would be lost, corrupted, transformed if the ritual succeeds?" No one had an answer to that, not even Varian. We spent the remainder of the night refining the plan, identifying the specific moment when intervention would be most effective, the particular discord I would need to introduce into the ritual's harmony. The next day, I left our sanctuary for the last time, making my way toward the choir's territory, toward the amphitheater where the new crescendo would be performed. I carried nothing with me, needing no supplies for a journey from which I did not expect to return. My only possession was a small data slate containing our complete records, our observations and analyses, our warning to whoever might come after. This I would hide somewhere along the way, adding to the archives we had already established throughout the city. The journey took me through areas I had not visited since the Legion's departure, districts that had been central to their grand design, that had housed their most elaborate performances, their most extreme experiments. The architecture remained twisted, impossible angles, and non-Euclidean geometries that hurt the mind to look upon. But nature had begun to reclaim some spaces, vines and fungal growths extending over warped surfaces, vegetation adapted to the lingering warp energies pushing through cracks in corrupted stone. As I moved deeper into what had been the Legion's territory, now the choir's domain, I began to encounter patrols, groups of robed figures moving with the synchronized precision that marked the choir's adherents. I did not hide from them, did not attempt to avoid detection. Instead, I walked openly, allowing my altered form to be visible, to be recognized for what it was. The first patrol that spotted me reacted with alarm, weapons raising, voices calling challenges. But as they drew closer, as they perceived the nature of my modifications, their hostility transformed into something closer to reverence. They approached cautiously, one figure detaching from the group to address me directly. "You bear the mark of the Legion's touch," he said, his voice distorted by the mask he wore, by modifications to his vocal apparatus that allowed him to speak in harmonics impossible for a normal human throat. "You were part of the first crescendo." "I was," I confirmed, seeing no reason to lie. "I was prepared as an instrument in their symphony, though the work was not completed before the ritual failed." The patrol leader conferred briefly with his companions, their communication consisting of gestures and subtle tonal variations rather than words. Then he turned back to me. "You will come with us," he said. "The conductor will wish to see you, to evaluate your potential contribution to the new performance." I allowed myself to be escorted through the choir's territory, past groups of adherents engaged in various aspects of preparation for the coming ritual. Some practiced complex movements, their bodies flowing in patterns that seemed to distort the space around them. Others vocalized, their modified throats producing sounds that resonated with the architecture, causing stone and metal to vibrate in sympathy. Still others underwent surgical modifications, procedures performed in open pavilions as both demonstration and instruction for those who would later experience similar transformations. The amphitheater rose before us, smaller than the Legion's grand structure but more precisely designed, its proportions adhering to mathematical ratios I could now perceive and understand, ratios that resonated with both material reality and warp energies. The exterior was deceptively simple, almost austere, concealing the complexity that lay within. I was led through a series of passages, each designed to prepare the mind and senses for what lay at the center, each subtly altering perception through acoustic properties, through careful manipulation of light and shadow, through olfactory stimuli that triggered specific neural responses. By the time we reached the central chamber, my altered senses were heightened, my awareness expanded beyond normal parameters. The chamber itself was a perfect acoustic space, a sphere whose interior surface was composed of materials that captured and reflected sound with supernatural precision. Tiered seating surrounded a central platform, arranged to provide every observer with an unobstructed view, an optimal acoustic experience. Above the platform hung crystalline structures that caught and refracted light, creating patterns that complemented and enhanced the audio elements of performance. And on the platform stood the conductor, the Legion commander I had seen directing the rehearsal. Up close, the extent of his transformation was even more apparent, more horrifying. His body was a testament to survival through willpower alone, a collection of disparate elements held together by nothing but stubborn intent. His armor, fused with his flesh, moved with liquid grace, despite its apparent weight and rigidity. His face, if it could still be called a face, was in constant motion, features flowing and reforming in patterns that never quite resolved into a stable configuration. He turned as we entered, his attention focusing on me with palpable intensity. I felt the pressure of his gaze like a physical force, probing, evaluating, measuring my potential utility. "Ah," he said, his voice a harmony of tones that resonated throughout the chamber. "The unfinished symphony returns, the instrument that never played its note." He approached, moving around me in a slow circle, examining my altered form from all angles. One hand, more talon than human appendage, reached out to trace the patterns incised into my flesh, the modifications begun but never completed during the first crescendo. "Interesting," he murmured. "The work continues even without guidance, even without purpose. The pattern evolves of its own accord, adaptation without direction. Fascinating." He completed his circuit, coming to stand before me again, his constantly shifting features arranging themselves momentarily into an expression of satisfaction. "You will join our performance," he declared. "Your modifications, incomplete as they are, represent a valuable addition to our ensemble, and your presence, your participation, offers a pleasing symmetry, a connection to the original work that may help to anchor the new composition, to establish the necessary resonances. I bowed my head, feigning submission, acceptance. "I will serve," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I will contribute to the harmony of the whole." The conductor seemed pleased by my acquiescence, though it was difficult to be certain given the instability of his features. He gestured to the patrol leader who had escorted me. "Prepare him," he instructed. "Complete the modifications begun by our brethren. Make him ready for the performance." I was led from the chamber to a surgical pavilion, a space dedicated to the transformation of volunteers into the instruments required for the crescendo. Medicae adepts, their own bodies modified to enhance their precision and endurance, awaited with tools that combined the clinical efficiency of surgical implements with the artistry of a sculptor's instruments. I submitted to their ministrations, allowing them to continue the work begun by the Legion's artificers. They studied the patterns already established, the modifications already performed, and extended them according to designs provided by the conductor. Additional incisions were made, following the lines already present in my flesh. Subcutaneous implants were inserted, devices that would amplify and direct the energies channeled during the ritual. Nerve clusters were modified, sensory apparatus enhanced, vocal structures altered to produce specific tonal ranges. Throughout the process, I remained conscious, my altered physiology allowing me to endure pain that would have overwhelmed an unmodified human. I observed the procedures with detached interest, noting the differences between the choir's techniques and those I remembered from the Legion's work. The choir's approach was more precise, more controlled, but lacked the warp-touched artistry that had made the Legion's modifications so effective, so transformative. Days passed as the work continued, each session building upon the previous, gradually reshaping me into the instrument required for the crescendo. Between procedures, I was housed with other modified volunteers, participants in the coming performance who had already undergone similar transformations. They spoke little, their attention focused inward on the changes occurring within their bodies and minds. But when they did speak, it was of the coming ritual, of the transcendent experience it promised, of the honor of serving as conduits for their God's manifestation. Their faith was absolute, their dedication complete. They had given themselves wholly to the choir's purpose, to the conductor's vision. I listened, I observed, I gathered information that might aid in my planned disruption of the ritual. I learned the structure of the new composition, the specific role each modified participant would play, the critical moments when the barrier between realities would be thinnest, most vulnerable to manipulation. And as the preparations continued, as the date of the crescendo approached, I felt changes within myself beyond those introduced by the choir's surgeons. The pattern established by the Legion, interrupted but never truly stopped, continued its slow evolution, adapting to the new modifications, incorporating them into some larger design whose purpose I could sense but not fully comprehend. I began to experience moments of expanded perception, brief intervals when my awareness extended beyond material reality, when I could perceive the warp directly, could sense the entities that moved within it. These episodes were fleeting, disorienting, but each left me with new insights, new understanding of the forces we were dealing with, the powers the choir sought to invoke. Finally, the day of the crescendo arrived. The amphitheater was prepared, every surface cleaned and consecrated, every acoustic property tested and refined. The participants, myself included, were given final modifications, adjustments to ensure perfect harmony, perfect resonance. We were arranged in precise geometric patterns on and around the central platform, each positioned to maximize both individual contribution and collective effect. The audience began to arrive, filing into the tiered seating that surrounded us. They were adherents of the choir, believers who had not undergone the full range of modifications required for direct participation, but who would serve as witnesses, as amplifiers for the energies raised during the ritual. Their presence, their reactions, would form part of the composition, adding layers of emotion and sensation to the central performance. The conductor appeared last, emerging from a chamber beneath the platform, rising to take his position at the center of our formation. His transformed body seemed more stable now, more controlled, as if he had marshaled all his remaining will, all his remaining power, for this final performance. His constantly shifting features settled briefly into an expression of focused determination, of absolute conviction. Today, he addressed us, his voice resonating through the amphitheater, through our modified bodies. We complete what was begun. Today, we perfect what was flawed. Today, we welcome our God into the material realm, not as a visitor, not as a temporary manifestation, but as a permanent presence, a true incarnation. He raised his hands, the gesture signaling the beginning of the ritual, the commencement of the new crescendo. And as one, we began to perform, each contributing our assigned part to the greater whole, each channeling energies according to the pattern established during weeks of rehearsal. The music that rose from our collective effort defied description, transcended conventional understanding of sound and harmony. It incorporated elements that existed outside normal sensory perception, frequencies that resonated with the fabric of reality itself, with the barriers between dimensions. As it built in complexity and power, I felt the space around us beginning to change, to warp and flex as the veil between worlds thinned. Above the platform, the air shimmered, rippled, folded in upon itself in patterns of impossible geometry. Colors appeared that had no place in the normal visual spectrum, hues that conveyed emotions rather than wavelengths of light. The audience responded, their reactions feeding back into the composition, adding layers of sensation and experience that enriched and amplified the central themes. I performed my assigned role precisely, channeling energies through my modified body exactly as instructed, contributing to the harmony that was gradually, inexorably, opening a pathway between realities. I felt the entity's attention focus upon our ritual, upon our offering, assessing its quality, its perfection, with the critical appreciation of a connoisseur presented with a work of supreme artistry. And I waited for the critical moment, the precise instant when my intervention would be most effective, when a single discordant note would disrupt the entire composition, would cause the entity to withdraw its manifestation, to reject the offering as it had rejected the Legion's original attempt. The ritual progressed, building toward its climax, toward the moment when the veil would part completely, when the entity would begin its manifestation in material form. The conductor's movements became more expansive, more commanding, directing the flow of energies with absolute precision, with perfect control. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the critical juncture when all elements aligned, when the gateway stood poised to open fully. I prepared to introduce my discord, to disrupt the pattern established with such care, such precision. But as I gathered myself for this final act, this deliberate sabotage, I felt something shift within me, felt the pattern established by the Legion's original work, evolved through months of unsupervised adaptation, suddenly complete itself, suddenly reveal its true purpose. The modifications they had begun, interrupted before completion, had not been designed to make me a simple conduit, a passive instrument in their symphony. They had been creating something more complex, more independent, a component capable of active participation, of conscious contribution to the final composition. I understood then why I had survived when so many others had not, why my transformation had continued even without guidance or purpose. I had been designed as a fail-safe, a backup system to be activated if the primary ritual failed. My evolving modifications, my expanding perception, my growing understanding of the forces involved, all had been leading to this moment, this opportunity for intervention. But not the intervention I had planned, not the simple disruption that would cause the ritual to fail again. No, my body, my transformed being, offered a different possibility, a third path between success and failure, between manifestation and rejection. Instead of introducing discord, I began to channel the energies flowing through me in a new pattern, a variation on the established theme that neither supported nor disrupted the ritual but redirected it, transformed its purpose and effect. Through my modified body, through the structures evolved over months of adaptation, I shaped the energies into a configuration that would not open a gateway for manifestation, but create a barrier, a permanent seal between realities. The conductor sensed the change immediately, his perfect control of the ritual allowing him to detect even subtle variations in the flow of energies. He turned toward me, his shifting features arranging themselves into an expression of rage, of horrified understanding. "No," he cried, his voice cutting through the complex harmonies of the ritual. "You will destroy everything. You will ruin the perfection we have achieved." He moved toward me, his transformed body flowing across the platform with impossible speed, his taloned hands extended to stop me, to silence the new pattern I was introducing into the composition. But he was too late. The energies were already flowing according to my direction, the ritual already, transforming from a summoning into a sealing, from an invitation into a banishment. Above the platform, the shimmering air, the incipient gateway, began to change. Instead of expanding, instead of opening to allow manifestation, it was contracting, condensing, forming a knot of energy that pulsed with constrained power. Through it, I sensed the entity's reaction, its rage and frustration as it realized what was happening, as it understood that instead of gaining access to the material realm, it was being further separated from it, further isolated in the Imperium. The conductor reached me, his taloned hands closing around my throat, seeking to stop my part in the ritual, to prevent me from completing the pattern. But the energies already in motion could not be so easily halted. They flowed through me, through him, through all the modified participants, binding us together in a final, terrible harmony. "You have doomed us all," the conductor hissed, his voice a discord of rage and despair. "You have condemned us to oblivion." I could not respond, could not explain that what I offered was not destruction but transformation, not oblivion but transcendence of a different kind. The energies building within and around us had reached a critical threshold, a point beyond which control or direction was impossible. They would follow the pattern established, would complete the work begun, regardless of individual intention or intervention. Above us, the knot of energy pulsed once, twice, then expanded outward in a wave of force that engulfed the entire amphitheater. I felt it pass through me, through the conductor, through every participant and observer, carrying us into a space between spaces, a realm between realities. For an instant that seemed to last an eternity, I experienced existence from a perspective beyond physical limitation, beyond temporal constraints. I saw our world, our city from outside, saw the patterns of corruption and influence that had been established, the resonances that connected it to the warp, to the entity that sought manifestation. And I saw those connections severed, those resonances disrupted, as the wave of energy expanded outward from the amphitheater, washing over the city, the planet, cleansing it of the taint that had been introduced, sealing the pathways that had been opened between realities. Then, with a final surge of power, the wave contracted, collapsed back upon itself, drawing all who had participated in the ritual, all who had been present in the amphitheater, into a singularity of energy and consciousness that winked out of existence in our reality, leaving behind only emptiness, only silence. I do not know how long I existed in that state of non-being, that condition between realities. Time had no meaning, no relevance to what we had become. We were energy, consciousness, pattern, existing in a space that was neither material realm nor immaterium, but something other, something unique. The conductor was there, and all who had participated in the ritual, all who had witnessed it. We were separate yet connected, individual yet collective, bound together by what we had experienced, by what we had become. Some, like the conductor, raged against this transformation, this unexpected outcome. Others embraced it, finding in this new existence a form of transcendence they had not anticipated but could appreciate nonetheless. I observed, I witnessed, I recorded, continuing the role I had assumed since the Legion's arrival, since the beginning of our world's transformation. But now my observation extended beyond material reality, beyond conventional perception. I witnessed the aftermath of our disappearance, the effects of the sealing wave on our world, on the city we had left behind. The corruption lingered, the physical alterations to architecture and landscape remained, but the connection to the warp, the thinning of the veil between realities, had been severed, sealed, made impermeable. The entity's influence was gone, its attention diverted, its interest in our world extinguished by the failure of its servants, by the unexpected outcome of their ritual. Those citizens who remained, those who had survived both the Legion's occupation and the choir's activities, emerged slowly from hiding, from the shadows where they had concealed themselves. They found a city empty of both threat and promise, a place where the impossible had occurred but would not occur again, where the horrors they had witnessed were consigned to memory, to history, rather than ongoing reality. They began to rebuild, to reclaim, to reshape their environment according to human needs, human desires, rather than the aesthetic of corruption, the architecture of excess. They established new communities, new governance, new systems of belief that acknowledged what had occurred but focused on recovery, on survival, on the future rather than the past. And eventually, others came. Imperial forces, drawn by the silence of a once compliant world, by the cessation of all communication, all tribute. They found a population changed by their experiences, marked by exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. They found a city bearing the physical evidence of corruption, of warp influence, of heretical activity. Their response was as expected, as inevitable given the Imperium's doctrines, its absolute intolerance of deviation, of contamination. Fire cleansed the city, purged it of all trace of the Legion's presence, the choir's activities. Those citizens who could not demonstrate their purity, their resistance to corruption, were included in this cleansing, this purification through flame. A new city rose from the ashes, a new population was imported, a new governor installed. Records were altered, history rewritten, the truth of what had occurred concealed behind layers of censorship, of deliberate amnesia imposed from above. But some evidence remained, some record of the truth. The archives Varian and I had established, hidden throughout the old city and its surroundings, survived in part. Some were discovered by the new inhabitants, examined, then destroyed as dangerous as potential sources of contamination. But others remained undiscovered, preserved beneath ruins or within sealed chambers, waiting for someone with the courage, the curiosity, to find them, to read them, to understand what had occurred on this world. And we remained as well, those of us drawn into that space between realities, that existence between existences, not alive in any conventional sense, not dead by any traditional definition, but continuing, persisting, witnessing. The conductor and his most devoted followers eventually found a way to leave this state, to return to the warp, to rejoin the entity they had served, accepting whatever punishment, whatever use it might have for such failed servants. Others chose to remain, finding in this liminal existence a form of peace, of purpose, that had eluded them in material reality. They became observers like myself, witnesses to the flow of time, the progression of events, the slow healing of wounds inflicted upon the fabric of existence by the Legion's experiments, the choir's rituals. As for me, I continue as I began, as a recorder, a chronicler, a keeper of truth in a realm where truth is malleable, where reality is subject to perception and interpretation. I watch, I remember, I preserve the knowledge of what occurred, of how close our world came to becoming a gateway for entities beyond human comprehension, beyond human survival. And sometimes, when conditions align, when pathways open briefly between our state and material reality, I reach out, I touch the minds of those who might understand, who might use the knowledge I offer to prevent similar occurrences, similar corruptions. I whisper warnings, I share memories, I offer glimpses of the truth behind the sanitized histories, the official accounts. I am Jorvan, Hale, the last witness, the final observer. My body is gone, transformed into energy, into pattern, into consciousness without form, but my purpose remains, my role continues. I bear witness to the symphony of flesh, to the perfect horror brought by the Emperor's children, to the corruption that lingered long after their departure. And I will continue to bear witness, to warn, to preserve the truth, until the last note of existence fades into silence, until the final chord of reality resolves into whatever awaits beyond the end of all things.